They laughed the day she dragged her last coin across the counter of the Harwick Rail Yard office. A woman alone, 31 years old, with a wool coat gone thin at the elbows and a carpet bag that held everything she still owned in this world, which was not much, and which she had counted twice that morning in the gray light of a borrowed room. $3.40. The sum total of Nora Callum's life after the bank took the farm, after her late husband's brother produced a document she had never seen and could not prove was false, and after the county clerk in Harwick, Colorado, stamped a seal on her dispossession with the same bored indifference he might use to mark a crate of dry goods. $3.40, and a talent for numbers she had never quite found a use for, and a stubbornness her mother had always called a gift and the world had always called a problem. She spent $2.75 of it that very afternoon. The rail yard foreman, a man named Dooley Marsh, who smelled of pipe tobacco and contempt, sold her the old car for that price because it was, in his words, not worth the timber it would cost to burn it. Car number 44. A decommissioned Denver and Rio Grande passenger coach, sitting at the far end of the Harwick spur line, its wheels sunk into the rust and the weeds, its paint the color of an old bruise. Nora paid him. Dooley Marsh laughed. Two men loading freight nearby laughed too. She walked down the gravel bed toward the car without looking back, and the laughter followed her like dust. What none of them knew, what Nora herself did not yet know, was that the ceiling of car number 44 had been sealed shut for 11 years, and what rested inside that sealed compartment above the tin panels was not merely a secret. It was the key to everything this town had lost, and everything it deserved to find again. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Callum, if you are watching from a place that feels forgotten, a life that others have written off. Tell us about it in the comments. You may find you are in good company tonight. Nora Callum was born in 1861 in a sod house outside of Pueblo, Colorado, to a father who surveyed land for the territory and a mother who kept the books for a dry goods cooperative in the nearest town, 6 miles away, which she rode to on a mule every Tuesday and Thursday, without complaint for 17 years. Her father, Edmund Callum, was a quiet man with an extraordinary eye for the lay of the land. He could look at a hillside and read it the way a preacher reads scripture, seeing in its slopes and hollows what had been and what might be. Her mother, Rose Callum, had a mind like a well-made drawer. Everything in it fit together, nothing was lost, and she could find any figure she had ever recorded without searching more than a moment. Between the two of them, they raised Nora to understand that the world had a structure underneath it, and that structure could be known if you paid attention. Edmund taught her to read elevation, to understand how water moved, to recognize the kinds of soil that held secrets in their layers. He had a battered surveyor's transit that he let Nora look through on clear mornings, and she would spend an hour lining up the crosshairs on distant fence posts and crumbling rock formations, while he explained what the numbers meant. The land, he told her, is always trying to tell you something. Most people are just too busy or too proud to listen. Rose taught her arithmetic, and then bookkeeping, and then the more subtle art of reading a ledger, not just for what it said, but for what it was hiding. A set of books that balanced too neatly was a set of books that had been arranged, Rose would say, pressing her finger to a column of figures. Honest accounts have small imperfections. They have the smell of real life in them. Nora absorbed this the way children absorb things their parents do not realize they are teaching, not as a lesson, but as a way of seeing. She was 12 when her father died of a fever that came on fast and left no room for goodbyes. She was 14 when her mother's cooperative failed, and Rose spent 2 years quietly working off the debts of neighbors who could not cover their own, because she believed that a community was only as solvent as its least fortunate member. By the time Nora was 17, she could survey a parcel of ground, keep a double-entry ledger, and identify 6 varieties of Colorado clay by their color and texture. She was also, by then, deeply acquainted with loss, and with the particular dignity required to survive it without bitterness. She married Thomas Callum in 1884, a good-natured man who ranched a modest spread north of Harwick, and whose great virtue was that he recognized ability in others and got out of its way. He let Nora manage the books. He let her expand their kitchen garden into a small market operation that supplied 3 restaurants in town. He listened when she said the south pasture was eroding and they should move the herd before the spring floods came. They were not wealthy, but they were solvent, and they were building something, and for 6 years, Nora woke each morning with the specific satisfaction of a person whose labor is accumulating into a life. Thomas died in the winter of 1890, a horse accident, simple and sudden and entirely without meaning, the way most real tragedies are. He was 34, Nora was 29, and she had no children, and she had a ranch that now needed to be run by 1 person instead of 2, and she did it. She ran it for 2 years. She kept the books, managed the hands, sold the cattle at a fair price, and paid every debt on time. She was not merely surviving. She was, by any honest measure, succeeding, which is why what happened next was not the result of any failure on her part. We want you to understand that clearly before we tell you the rest. Thomas Callum had a younger brother named Gerald, who had not worked the land a day in his adult life, and who had spent a decade in Denver cultivating the kind of connections that thrive in courthouses and bank offices. Gerald Callum arrived in Harwick in the spring of 1892 with a document he claimed was a prior deed, a handwritten agreement, he said, between their father and Thomas, stipulating that the ranch would pass to the surviving son in the event of Thomas's death, superseding any subsequent arrangement. The document was dated 1879. Thomas had never mentioned it. Nora had never seen it. She could not prove it was false, and Gerald had 2 men from Denver willing to swear they had witnessed it. The county clerk, a man named Aldrich Prout, who owed Gerald Callum several favors of the kind that are never spoken aloud, reviewed the document for 4 days and then ruled in Gerald's favor. Nora hired the only lawyer in Harwick, a decent but overmatched man named Foley, who filed 2 objections that were dismissed within a week. She wrote to the Territorial Land Office. She received a form letter. She wrote again. She received the same form letter, differently dated. By August of 1892, Nora Callum had been removed from the ranch she had built with her own hands. Gerald Callum moved in with a hired foreman and immediately sold off the market garden operation she had developed, at a price well below its worth, to a man who let it die within a season. Nora took what was legally portable, her clothes, her mother's ledger books, her father's surveyor's transit, and the cash she had kept in a tin box that Gerald had not known to look for, and she moved into a rented room above the Harwick hardware store. She spent the next 6 weeks looking for work and found almost none. The town knew what had happened. Half of them thought it was a shame. None of them were willing to put themselves across from Gerald Callum by hiring his dispossessed sister-in-law. By October, she had $3.40 left, and she had been asked to vacate her room by the end of the week, and she was standing in the Harwick Rail Yard looking at a decommissioned coach car because she needed somewhere to sleep, and she had run out of better ideas. The car sat at the end of the spur line like something the railroad had simply forgotten to grieve. Its exterior was a deep, weary burgundy, or had been once. Now it was the color of old blood and weathered wood, peeling in long strips that revealed the gray timber beneath. The steps were intact. The door, though swollen with age, opened when Nora put her shoulder into it with enough conviction. Inside, the air was cold and still, and smelled of dust and leather, and something older that she could not immediately name. The particular smell of a place that has held many human lives and been emptied of them all. The interior was long and narrow, with wooden bench seats that folded down, 10 on each side, upholstered in cracked horsehair fabric the color of dried moss. The windows were fogged with grime but unbroken, which she noted with relief. The floor was solid. The walls were paneled in dark wood that had gone dull but not rotten. At the far end was a small iron stove, cold and orange with surface rust, but structurally sound when she knocked on it with her knuckle. It was, she decided, habitable. It was, in the most technical sense, shelter. She spent the rest of that day sweeping. She had a broom, a bucket, and a fierce and quiet resolve that had nowhere else to go. She swept the dust out through the far door and wiped the windows with a rag until the gray afternoon light came through in long, pale stripes across the floor. She found a crack in the stovepipe fitting and wedged it with a piece of tin she pried from the outer wall. She had fuel enough for a small fire, and she built one and sat in the warmth of it as the sun went down over the Harwick yards. And she did not cry, not because she was not sad, but because she was saving something. It was the following morning, in the full light of day, that she first noticed the ceiling. She had been lying on a folded-down bench seat, looking upward in the gray early light, when she saw the line. It ran along the center of the car's tin ceiling, about 2/3 of the way from the front. A seam that did not match the regular seams of the paneling. The tin on either side of it was the same aged gray as the rest, but the seam itself was slightly raised, and when she stood on the bench seat and pressed her palm against it, she felt a faint hollow resonance that the rest of the ceiling did not have. She pressed harder. The panel did not give. She ran her fingers along the seam's length and found, near the left wall, a small brass latch no larger than her thumbnail, painted over so many times it had nearly disappeared into the surface. She worked her thumbnail under it. It resisted. She used the small penknife she kept in her coat pocket, working gently, and after several minutes the latch turned with a sound like a sigh. The panel swung downward on a hidden hinge, and a smell came out. Paper and cedar and something faintly chemical, like the ink used in official documents, and in the shallow compartment above, resting on a cedar-lined shelf no more than 6 inches deep and the width of the car, were a leather satchel, 2 rolled tubes of what appeared to be drafting paper, and a small brass-bound box. Nora stood on the bench seat and stared at these things for a long moment without touching them. Then she lifted them down, one by one, and laid them on the seat beside her, and sat down, and folded her hands in her lap, and breathed. The leather satchel contained documents. She opened it carefully, because the leather was dry and beginning to crack at the corners, and she spread the papers on the seat with the methodical care her mother had taught her, smoothing each one flat before moving to the next. There were letters, a dozen of them, bound with a length of twine. There were receipts. There were 2 official-looking documents on heavy cream stock with territorial seals embossed at the top. And there was a ledger, small, compact, bound in green cloth, the kind her mother would have recognized immediately. She opened the ledger first because she understood ledgers. The entries were dated between 1879 and 1881. The handwriting was small and precise and slightly left-leaning, the hand of someone who had been schooled in a hurry and had developed economy as a result. The entries recorded transactions, payments made and received, in a form that was, on its surface, entirely ordinary. But Nora had learned from her mother to read what the ledger was hiding, and within 20 minutes she understood that this was not an ordinary accounting. The payments recorded in the ledger were disbursements from a fund. The fund was identified only by the initials HCIF, Harwick Community Infrastructure Fund. The disbursements went to a contractor named Voss for grading, to a supplier in Denver for pipe fittings, to a surveyor identified only as EC. And there it was, EC Edmund Callum, her father. She sat very still for a moment, and then she opened the rolled drafting tubes. The first contained a survey map, her father's work. She recognized the hand immediately, the same notations she had watched him make through the lens of his transit on clear Colorado mornings. It was a survey of the Harwick Valley, dated 1880, and it showed something she had never known existed: a proposed water conveyance system, a network of pipes and channels, that would have drawn water from the upper Harwick Creek into a storage basin above the town and distributed it to farms and homesteads across the valley floor. The survey was complete. The engineering was sound. She could see, in the precision of her father's measurements, the months of work it represented. The second tube contained the architectural plans for the distribution system itself, drawn by someone other than her father, a professional draftsman by the quality of the line work, and stamped with the seal of a territorial engineer named Harlan Buford. She opened the letters next. They told the story in pieces, and she assembled it the way her father had taught her to read a hillside, patiently, looking for what connected. The Harwick Community Infrastructure Fund had been organized in 1879 by a coalition of valley farmers and the town's founding merchant, a man named August Drew, who had since died. They had raised $4,200 over 2 years, an extraordinary sum for a small community, gathered in small amounts from dozens of families who believed they were investing in a water system that would secure the valley's future. Edmund Callum had surveyed the land. Harlan Buford had drawn the plans. The fund had contracted with a man named Clement Voss to begin the grading work in the spring of 1881. And then Clement Voss had taken the money and left the territory, not all of it. The ledger showed that approximately half the fund, $2,060, had been dispersed to Voss in advance payments for labor and materials. When Voss disappeared, the remaining money in the fund was held by its treasurer, a man named Silas Prout, Aldrich Prout's father, and according to the final letter in the bundle, written by August Drew in the autumn of 1881 and addressed to the Territorial Land Office, Silas Prout had subsequently claimed that the fund's remaining capital had been lost when the bank in which it was deposited had failed. The water system was never built. The families who had contributed their savings received nothing. The valley spent the next decade hauling water and watching their smaller operations fail one by one for lack of reliable irrigation. The brass-bound box held 2 more things. A bank receipt dated October 1881, showing a deposit of $2,040 into an account under the name S.E. Prout, not a failed bank, but a Denver institution that was, as far as Nora knew, still operating, and a letter from Harlan Buford, the territorial engineer, addressed to Silas Prout, stating that the survey and plans were complete and ready for implementation, and that he was sending them via the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad in the care of a conductor named James Elwell in car number 44. Car number 44. Nora sat in the cold morning light of that abandoned railroad car for a very long time. Then she picked up her mother's ledger books and her father's surveyor's transit, and she began to work. She spent 3 days reading every document twice, making her own notes in a composition book she had found in her carpet bag, half filled with figures from the ranch's last solvent season. She cross-referenced the ledger against the letters. She traced every disbursement, every receipt. She identified the names of 14 families who appeared in the donation records, families who had contributed to the HCIF and received nothing. Some of those names she recognized. Some of those families, or their children, were still in the Harwick Valley. On the 4th day she walked into town. She went first to Foley's office, the lawyer who had failed to stop Gerald Callum, not because she blamed him for that failure, but because she trusted his fundamental decency. She laid the documents on his desk in the order she had organized them, and she walked him through them with the same patience her mother had used when teaching her to read a column of figures. Foley was a man who did not startle easily, but by the time she reached the bank receipt, his face had gone very still and very quiet in the way that faces go when they are understanding something large. He said, "Nora, do you understand what this is?" She said she did. He said, "Aldrich Prout is the county clerk." She said she knew. He said, "Gerald Callum and Aldrich Prout have been..." He stopped. He looked at the receipt again. "They've been in business together for years." She said she knew that too. What happened next was not fast, because nothing that matters is fast. Foley wrote to the Territorial Land Office, not a letter this time, but a formal legal brief, with the bank receipt as its first exhibit and the HCIF ledger as its second. He wrote to the Denver institution where the Prout deposit had been made and requested records. He wrote to the estate of August Drew, whose son, it turned out, was living in Colorado Springs and had been wondering for 20 years what had become of his father's water project. He wrote to the families whose names appeared in the donation records, the ones still in the valley, carefully and without raising expectations he could not yet meet. Nora, meanwhile, went to see those families herself. This was the part that cost her the most, not in money, which she did not have, but in the particular courage required to walk up to a homestead and knock on a door and tell people who had learned not to hope that there might be something worth hoping for. She walked. She did not have a horse. The valley was wide, and the farms were scattered, and the October air had turned sharp and thin, and she walked to every door on her list, with her father's survey map under her arm and her mother's ledger under the other, and she told them what she had found and what it might mean. Some of them were skeptical. A woman named Dora Hennessy, whose family had contributed $60 to the fund in 1880, listened to Nora in complete silence for 20 minutes, then said that she had heard promises before, and that promises in this valley had a way of becoming the same empty air as everything else. Nora said she understood that. She put the ledger on Dora Hennessy's kitchen table and showed her the entry with the Hennessy name, and then she put the bank receipt beside it, and she let the documents speak, because they were better at it than she was. Dora Hennessy looked at the receipt for a long time. Then she looked at Nora. Then she said she would come to the meeting. Gerald Callum heard about the documents within a week. Harwick was not a large town, and news moved through it the way water moves through clay, slowly but without stopping. He came to the rail yard one morning with 2 men behind him and told Nora that the documents were fraudulent and that she had stolen them from private property, and that he would be speaking to his friend Aldrich Prout about having her removed from the rail car she was squatting in illegally. He was loud about it. There were men working in the yard who could hear him clearly. Nora listened to him finish. Then she said, in a voice calibrated to carry the same distance his had, that the documents had been found in a compartment within a railroad car she had purchased legally from Dooley Marsh for $2.75, and that she had receipts for the purchase, and that the documents themselves were the property of the Harwick Community Infrastructure Fund, a legal entity whose surviving members had been identified and contacted, and that the Territorial Land Office had already been notified of their existence and content. Gerald Callum's face went through several colors. He left. Dooley Marsh, who had heard all of it, said nothing for a moment, then went back to his work with a look on his face that suggested he was revising some of his opinions about the value of car number 44. The territorial investigation took 4 months. The Denver bank confirmed the deposit. The records confirmed that no Harwick bank had failed in 1881 in the manner Silas Prout had claimed. The estate of August Drew provided a corroborating letter from Drew himself, written in 1881 and never sent, in which he described his suspicions about the fund's disappearing capital. Foley, working with a territorial attorney named Oakes, who came up from Pueblo with a genuine appetite for the case, built a record that left very little room for interpretation. Aldrich Prout resigned his position as county clerk in February of 1893 without waiting to be formally charged. He left Harwick within the week. The Denver bank, under territorial order, released the funds in the account that bore his father's name. The original deposit plus 11 years of accrued interest, which brought the total to just over $3,000, into a reconstituted trust administered by Foley and overseen by representatives of the original contributing families. Gerald Callum's deed, subjected to the scrutiny that Nora's own legal battle had not been able to compel, was quietly reviewed by the Territorial Land Office in the same proceeding. The 2 Denver witnesses, when deposed, gave accounts that did not agree with each other in several material details. The deed was voided in March of 1893. Nora did not receive her ranch back. The law moved in the direction of nullity, not restoration, and Gerald had already sold off portions of the property, but she received compensation, negotiated by Foley, that was fair and that Gerald paid, with the expression of a man swallowing something he had expected to keep. The water system was built in the summer and fall of 1893. The plans her father had surveyed and Harlan Buford had drawn were 13 years old, but they were sound, and the valley had not changed its contours. A contractor from Pueblo was hired, one with references this time, checked twice by Foley and once by Nora. The contributing families, those still in the valley, were made whole from the recovered fund first. The remainder financed the construction. By November of 1893, water ran from the upper Harwick Creek through a network of channels and pipes to a basin above the town, and from there to 17 farms and homesteads in the valley below, including Dora Hennessy's place, which had been fighting drought and hauling water by hand for a decade. Nora was there when they opened the main sluice. It was a cold, bright morning, the mountains white above the valley, the air so clear it seemed to ring. There were perhaps 40 people gathered at the basin, and when the water came through, brown at first with disturbed earth, then clearing to a pale amber, then running clean and silver in the morning light, someone started to clap, and then everyone did, and Dora Hennessy, who had said she had heard promises before, was standing at the edge of the basin with her hands pressed together and her eyes full of something that was not quite tears and not quite joy, but was the particular feeling of a wrong being righted after, long enough that you had stopped expecting it. Nora stood a little apart from the crowd, as she often did, and watched the water run. She had used the compensation from Gerald's settlement to buy a small house in Harwick proper. Nothing grand, a 2-room structure with a good stove and a window that faced west. And Foley had offered her a permanent position as his office accountant, which she had accepted. She was 32 years old. She had $3.40 worth of history behind her and a life she was building with her own hands. Again, which was the only way she had ever known how to build anything. Car number 44 still sat at the end of the spur line. She had moved out of it in the spring, when the house became available, and she had asked Dooley Marsh if there was any objection to leaving it where it was. Marsh, who had developed a respect for Nora that he expressed entirely through the absence of his usual contempt, said there was no objection he was aware of. The Valley families, at a meeting in July, voted to purchase the car from Nora. She accepted $1 for it, the minimum required for a legal transaction, and convert it into a small community reading room and records archive. It was painted a fresh dark red, its wheels given new blocks, its windows cleaned and fitted with glass that let in the long afternoon light. A small sign was hung above the door, painted by a woman named Clara Vane, who had a gift for such things. The sign read, Harwick Community Archive, EST, 1880. Restored 1893. Inside, in a case of glass and cedar, built by a carpenter named Holt, who had contributed $20 to the original fund, and never forgotten it, the ledger, the survey map, the plans, the letters, and the brass-bound box with its bank receipt were displayed for anyone who wanted to see them. Beside them, in the same case, was a brief account of how they had been found, written by Foley in his careful legal hand, and at the bottom of that account, a single additional line that Nora had not asked for and had not expected, but that she found, when she read it for the first time, to be entirely accurate. It read, "The documents were recovered by Nora Callum, daughter of Edmund Callum, who surveyed this valley, and of Rose Callum, who taught her to read what a ledger hides. We have told you before, and we will tell you again, that the things this world discards are rarely without worth. We have told you about women who found value in the overlooked, who built something lasting from what others called refuse, who walked toward the thing everyone else walked away from and found, in its abandoned interior, the truth that a whole community needed. Nora Callum did not set out to restore the Harwick Valley. She set out to survive the week. She had $3.40 and a talent she had inherited from two people who believed that the world had a structure underneath it. And she bought the cheapest thing available to her, and she paid attention, the way her father had taught her to pay attention to a hillside, and she read what was hidden, the way her mother had taught her to read what a ledger conceals. She did not do it for recognition. She did not do it for compensation, though the compensation when it came was just. She did it because the documents were there, and the truth was in them, and she was the kind of person who, when she found the truth, could not leave it sealed in the dark. The laughter at the rail yard on the day she bought car number 44, Dooley Marsh's laughter, the laughter of the freight men, the laughter that followed her down the gravel bed like dust. That laughter went quiet in stages, as truths have a way of silencing things, not with a single dramatic moment, but with the slow, accumulating weight of evidence. No one made a formal announcement that they had been wrong. No one came to Nora and confessed their mockery. But the town of Harwick, in the fall of 1893, stood at a basin of running water and clapped its hands, and the water that ran through the channel had its origin in a survey made by Edmund Callum in 1880, and the pipes that carried it were paid for with money that should never have been stolen, and the plans that guided the construction had been sealed in a sealing compartment above a decommissioned railroad car for 11 years, waiting for someone patient and stubborn and well-taught enough to find them. Nora Callum was 32 years old, and she had found them, and the water ran, and that was enough. Thank you for spending this evening with us and with Nora Callum. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who might need it tonight. Someone who is standing at the edge of something that looks like nothing and wondering whether it is worth the trouble. We believe it usually is. Before you go, we want to ask you one question, and we hope you will take it with you. What is something in your own life that others wrote off? An object, a place, a skill, a person, that turned out to hold more value than anyone expected? Leave your answer in the comments. We read them, every one, and they matter to us more than we can easily say. Until next time, stay close.